Hey everyone, this is a video about the business cycle, part of macroeconomics. What we see as the business cycle, what it does is it represents the short-term fluctuations of economic activity over time. So there are two different business cycles that we can look at. One where it looks at changes in real GDP over time, and another where it looks at changes in real GDP growth over time. So slightly different concepts. Slightly different cycles. We have some terminology that we need to get our heads around. So just got a bit of a list here. So an expansion, that occurs when there is increasing real GDP. So when there is economic growth, that's called an expansion. A boom occurs when unemployment is below the natural rate. So under 4.5%. A recovery is increasing real GDP when the economy is in an output gap. What do I mean by an output gap? It means when we're operating at far less than potential, and we're growing. That's called a recovery. A downturn is when the economy is still growing, but it's growing more slowly than before. So economic growth is starting to slow. So say it goes from 3% to 2% to 1%. That's a downturn. We're heading to perhaps towards a recession. Contraction. This is when the economy experiences negative economic growth, and that is a strange term, but it's when the GDP falls, right? Recession. This is negative growth again, but for 6 months or more. So it's when the economy shrinks for 6 months or more. That's called a recession. Okay, next page. A peak. We get a peak and a trough in both models, so it's a little bit confusing. A peak in terms of real GDP growth is the highest rate of growth that we get. In terms of real GDP, it's our peak just before growth is negative. So it's the most real GDP we have before it starts shrinking again. A trough. When we refer to real GDP growth, this is the lowest rate of growth that is happening. So we're going to have a low rate and then it's going to increase. And referring to real GDP, that's the point before growth is positive. So the GDP has shrunk to its lowest level, and then it's what it is at that lowest level, that's our trough, and then the economy starts growing. Okay, let's have a look at these models. So here is one model. This is the one looking at real GDP. So we have our blue line, which is our GDP. And we have this upward trend here. So this is potential output. This isn't a term we've really looked at yet. It's a thing about macroeconomics. It's a bit of a puzzle that comes together as we go. So it's how much we could potentially produce if we used all our resources. And it's a sort of a strange term because we can see here that we're producing more than potential. Sounds odd. It is legitimate in economics. We will see that in the future. Okay, so real GDP over time. So over time we can see it's growing. Here it is falling. Real GDP is less. So that means the economy is shrinking, right? And it shrinks and then it reaches this trough and then it starts growing again. Okay, so we can be a bit more precise with our labeling of this. So where GDP, where this curve is going up, that's an expansion or a recovery. So increase in GDP, it's an expansion or recovery. Okay, over here as well. And then we've got our boom over here, heading towards our peak. So we've got unemployment below the natural rate. That's why we're above potential. We've got our peak of real GDP here. Over this period, we can see real GDP is falling along the y-axis, right? if we look at the y-axis, the GDP is falling, so that's a contraction. Yes. It contracts until it starts to grow again. So the lowest point is our trough. Okay, and here, this model a little bit different, looks at real GDP growth. So we've got positive growth here, we've got negative growth. Negative growth, remember, is when the economy is shrinking. So this model looks a little bit different, that's fine. So we've got expansion. So even though this curve's going down, we're still getting, sorry, I'm pointing with my finger. That doesn't work for you guys. We're still getting positive growth, even though this curve is trending downwards, because the economy is still growing. So we might still be getting, we might peak our growth at say 4%, but we might still be growing at 2% here. It's just trending downwards, okay? And then we've got the same thing here. We've got a growth. If it's above this x-axis, it must be positive. So this would be our peak in output. So we've been growing, and then we start shrinking here. So this must be where GDP was at its highest. Yes. And if GDP growth is negative, that means the economy is shrinking along this period. So here it's shrinking by a lot, and here it's shrinking by not much. It's still shrinking. We've still got negative growth. And this is as low as output gets, because at this point it starts growing. The economy starts growing again. Got our peak in growth, peaks in growth here, because that might be the highest growth rate that we have. That's what we're looking at here, a growth rate. That's our peak in growth. And here is our downturn. So if we look back through our notes, we'll see a downturn is when the economy is still growing, but at a slower rate than before. So this is a downturn, and this over here is a downturn as well. Over here, we've got a trough in growth, because that's our lowest level of growth. These troughs can appear up here. Economies will do, or governments will do everything they can to avoid recessions. So they'll avoid negative growth. So often the trough will come above this x-axis, and that's fine. Okay, 3 things to know. It's not regular or predictable. So the way we draw these business cycles, it looks like, oh, it just goes like that. No, that's because governments will avoid them, because they're bad. If we've got a shrinking economy, we've got people leaving, falling out of work. So we've got people going through hard times. The government doesn't want that. They want people to live well. So for that reason, expansions usually last a lot longer than any contraction. So in Australia, we've had continuous expansions for over 20 years before we start to get any negative growth. And there is a pretty strong correlation between employment and real GDP. So as we get more growth, we get more people in jobs, because growth is the production of goods and services. And who do we need to produce goods and services? We need people. So there is a strong correlation there. All right, that's what we need to know for this video. So I will leave it there. Thank you.